"I'll never forget your kindness," Annie Brooks said, though at that moment she still did not know the name of the man standing before her. "Don't spend your life remembering a debt," Charles replied. "Spend it becoming the person you were meant to be." Annie stood a few feet away, staring at him beneath the harsh lights of the hospital hallway. She clutched Samuel's old wristwatch in one hand and the payment receipt in the other. Relief had softened the fear on her face, but confusion remained. "You're the one who paid my grandfather's entire hospital bill." Charles glanced toward Mrs. Keller, who quickly found a reason to study her computer screen. "I covered the remaining balance." "Why?" "Your grandfather needs continued care. And I heard Mrs. Keller has already given you 2 extensions. Is that right?" Annie swallowed. "Yes, sir." She returned to the billing counter and pushed 3 worn envelopes across its surface. "The first has my wages from the bakery. The second has what I earned cleaning rooms at the airport hotel. The last one is the money I saved for college books." She lowered her eyes. "That's everything I have. I asked for a payment plan, but my income isn't high enough for the hospital to approve an unsecured agreement for that much money." Mrs. Keller looked at Charles. "She's already working 2 jobs to cover the bills. She was asking about extra shifts, but she can barely keep her eyes open." Then, she turned to Annie. "You need sleep, young lady. I can sleep after my grandfather gets better." Charles said nothing for a moment. He studied Annie's flour-stained sleeves, the rainwater darkening her coat, and the old watch she held as though it were the most valuable object in the building. "Consider the money something you earned through your devotion to your grandfather," he said. Annie shook her head. "You don't even know who we are." "No, I don't." She looked down at the receipt. The balance that had threatened to separate Samuel from his cardiac team had been reduced to a single line. "Paid in full. It was $5,000, she said. "That's more than I earn in several months, and you gave it away without even knowing us." Her eyes lifted to his. "Why would you do that for someone you've never met?" Charles looked at the exhausted young woman before him. There was no calculation in her voice and no attempt to flatter him. She was simply trying to understand why a stranger had stepped into a burden she had believed belonged to her alone. "Because I don't like watching someone sacrifice her future over numbers printed on a piece of paper," he said. Annie went still. The confusion inside her slowly gave way to an emotion she could no longer hide. "But I can't accept something this large without giving anything back." Her voice trembled. "I can work for you. I can sign an agreement. I can repay a little every month. I already told you, this is not a loan." His tone was firm, but not unkind. Charles glanced again at the flower on her sleeve. "How long have you been working 2 jobs?" "Since my grandfather became sick." "And college?" "I postponed it, sir." "What were you planning to study?" "Law." "Why law?" Annie hesitated, then answered with the same honesty that had first drawn his attention. "Because poor families sign papers they don't understand every day. Then someone with more money tells them it was their fault for not reading carefully." Charles considered her words. He knew people who had attended the best law schools in the country and had never expressed the purpose of law so clearly. "I can still repay you," Annie said. "It may take years, but I will." Charles reached into his wallet and removed a business card. He stepped closer and placed it gently in her trembling palm. "Instead of thinking about repayment, go back to school. Study law the way you planned. One day, use what you learned to protect people who cannot protect themselves." Annie stared at the card. Charles Whitmore. She recognized the name at once. His company appeared in newspapers and business magazines. The Whitmore Foundation funded hospitals, community programs, and scholarships across California. She looked up at him again. Tears gathered in her eyes, but her voice was steady. "I'll never forget your kindness." Charles released a quiet breath. There was a stubborn strength in the 18-year-old that reminded him of the person he had once been, before success had filled his life with people who measured affection in shares, contracts, and inheritance. "All right," he said. "If you truly want to repay me, then stand on your own feet. Finish your education. Use your knowledge to defend people like your grandfather. That will be worth more to me than the money." Annie pressed the card between her fingers. Her pride no longer felt wounded. He had not asked her to become grateful, obedient, or indebted. He had given her a purpose larger than repayment. She drew a deep breath. "I promise." A rare smile crossed Charles's tired face. "Then we have an agreement." Annie nodded. Charles glanced toward the cardiac wing. Go on. Your grandfather is waiting for you. He turned toward the elevator. Annie remained beneath the hallway lights, watching him walk away. In one hand, she held Samuel's worn watch, its scratched face still running 5 minutes slow. In the other, she held a business card bearing the name of the stranger who had restored the future she thought she had lost. The elevator doors opened. Charles stepped inside and turned once before they closed. Go back to school, Annie. I will, she answered. The door slid shut, leaving her alone in the hallway. For the first time since Samuel had been admitted, Annie allowed herself to believe that both of them might still have a future. Mrs. Keller looked toward the hallway where Charles Whitmore had just disappeared. You should consider yourself lucky, young lady, she said. To Mr. Whitmore, that amount of money probably means very little. Now go on. Mr. Samuel has been asking about you. Annie held the receipt against her chest. It may not be much to him, she replied. But it saved the person I love most. I will never forget that. She turned toward the cardiac wing. And you should get some rest, Mrs. Keller called after her. Annie looked back and nodded. Thank you, ma'am. By the time Annie returned to Samuel's room, Samuel's eyes opened when she stepped inside. You look like you've seen a ghost, he said. Annie pulled the chair closer to his bed. Not a ghost. Then someone worse? She tried to smile, but the effort broke halfway. A stranger paid the rest of your hospital bill. Samuel stared at her. What stranger? His name is Charles Whitmore. The name meant nothing to him at first. Then his brows lifted. The businessman? The billionaire. Samuel looked toward the door, as if Charles might still be standing outside. Why would a billionaire pay my bill? He heard me talking to Mrs. Keller. What exactly did he hear? Annie looked down at the old watch in her hand. Enough. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment. You told them about college. I had to explain why I didn't have more money. You didn't have to explain anything. They were asking about income and a cosigner, and you told them you postponed school because of me. Annie placed the watch on the table beside his bed. I postponed school because you had a heart attack. That is not the same thing. It feels the same from this bed. His voice was weak, but the guilt in it was not. Annie leaned closer. You sold your truck when Mom got sick. You worked overtime when I needed braces. You learned how to braid my hair from a woman at church because I cried when you tried the first time. Don't sit there and act like I'm sacrificing some grand life for a stranger. Samuel looked at her for several seconds. I never wanted you to pay me back. I know. Do you? Yes. Then why are you trying so hard to do it? The question landed harder than she expected. Before she could answer, Nurse Reynolds entered with a paper cup and a wrapped sandwich. I'm bringing reinforcements, she said. Turkey, no mustard, and coffee that has offended everyone on this floor. Samuel glanced at Annie. She hasn't eaten. I know, Nurse Reynolds said. She told me coffee counts as dinner. It does when it's bad enough. It does not. The nurse placed the sandwich in Annie's hands. Eat before your grandfather tries to get out of bed and feed you himself. Samuel raised one finger. I've done worse. Annie peeled back the wrapper. Hunger came suddenly, sharp enough to make her hands shake. Nurse Reynolds checked Samuel's IV line. The payment authorization has been updated. Dr. Patel wants to keep you here for observation and adjust your medication tomorrow morning. Samuel nodded. So I'm staying. You're staying, and I owe a stranger $5,000. No, Annie said. He said it wasn't a loan. Samuel gave her a dry look. People with money say many things when they expect to be remembered. He didn't ask for anything. Not yet. Nurse Reynolds paused, then spoke carefully. Mr. Whitmore also refused to put his name on the donation. Samuel turned toward her. He could have asked the hospital to announce it, she continued. He didn't. He only asked that your care continue. Samuel's suspicion did not disappear, but it softened. Annie reached into her coat pocket and placed the business card beside his watch. Charles Whitmore, founder and chief executive officer, Whitmore Industries. Samuel picked it up with 2 fingers. He gave you this? He told me to call only when I was ready to help the next person. That sounds expensive. Annie almost laughed. You think everything sounds expensive. I drove a city bus for 32 years. Anything written on thick paper is expensive. Nurse Reynolds smiled and left them alone. Samuel studied the card again. What else did he say? He told me to go back to school. And what did you tell him? That I would. Samuel lowered the card. Did you mean it? Annie looked toward the monitor. I don't know how. The tuition deposit is due next month. Rent is behind. Your medication is going to cost more. I still have the bakery and the hotel. That was not my question. She met his eyes. Yes, she said. I meant it. Samuel rested his head against the pillow. Good, but you're still in the hospital, and you still have a future. Annie looked at the sandwich in her lap. You nearly died. So did your mother. I sold my truck, remember? That was different. No, it wasn't. Love makes people do foolish things and call them duty. You don't regret helping her. Not for 1 second. Then don't ask me to regret helping you. I'm not. Samuel's voice grew quieter. I'm asking you not to confuse love with disappearing. Annie said nothing. You can delay school, he said. You can take a different road. You can work harder than other people have to work. But don't stop because you think staying small is the price of loving me. She felt tears gathering and hated that he could always reach the part of her she kept hidden. I don't know whether I can afford it. Then we find out. We fill out forms. We talk to the financial aid office. We call every scholarship program in California if we have to. You need to recover. I can recover and complain at the same time. I've practiced both. Annie laughed despite herself. Samuel pointed toward the card. And you keep that. I don't want to owe him. You don't owe him obedience. You don't owe him your life. But he gave you time when we had run out of it. Annie ran her thumb over the raised letters of Charles's name. What am I supposed to do with that? Use it. To call him? No. Samuel shook his head. Use the time. If you empathize with Annie and believe her love and sacrifice for her grandfather deserve to be honored, please give this video a like. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from because someone living near you may be listening to Annie's story right alongside you. The next morning, Dr. Patel confirmed that Samuel's condition had stabilized. He would remain under observation for several more days, followed by weeks of cardiac rehabilitation. Annie listened closely, writing every instruction in a small notebook: medication times, dietary limits, warning signs, follow-up appointments. When the doctor left, Samuel pointed toward the notebook. You always write everything down, so I don't forget. Then write this down too. You are going back to college. Annie looked at him. That isn't a medical instruction. It is now. She wrote it at the bottom of the page. Return to school. That afternoon, while Samuel slept, Annie sat near the window and opened the introductory law textbook she had carried in her backpack for months. Charles's business card rested between the first 2 pages. Annie read until the words stopped blurring. 3 years later, Charles Whitmore's business card still rested between the first 2 pages of Annie's old law textbook. The edges had softened from being handled, and one corner had bent where she had once shoved the book into an overcrowded backpack before catching the morning bus. She no longer opened the card every day. She did not need to. By then, the words Charles had spoken in the hospital had become part of the way she made decisions. Use the time. Annie had done exactly that. She returned to school the following fall after securing a combination of grants, a merit scholarship, and a work-study position. The process had required more forms than she expected, several appeals, and 2 meetings with a financial aid officer who kept telling her the application was incomplete because Samuel's income records did not match the previous year. Samuel had sat beside her at the kitchen table while she organized tax papers into neat stacks. I drove a bus for 32 years, he said. I never knew retirement would involve this much paperwork. You complain every time I ask for one document. I'm retired. Complaining is one of the benefits. His recovery had been slow but steady. He took his medication with breakfast, attended cardiac rehabilitation twice a week, and stopped pretending fried food became healthy when eaten on Sundays. Annie still watched him too closely. If he paused while climbing the apartment stairs, she noticed. If he rubbed his chest after dinner, she asked 3 questions before he could finish the first answer. Samuel eventually returned to the East Oakland Community Center where he helped teenagers repair donated bicycles. You're supposed to be resting. Annie reminded him the first time she found him tightening a chain. I am resting. You're holding a wrench, a small wrench. He refused to live like a man waiting for his body to fail again. Watching him rebuild his routine taught Annie something she had not understood in the hospital. Caring for someone did not mean deciding what their life should look like. Her own life became a schedule written in different colors. Classes in blue ink, work shifts in black, Samuel's appointments in red. She studied political science, public policy, ethics, and accounting because a professor told her that good intentions meant little if she could not follow money through a set of records. She kept one shift a week at the bakery during her first year. The owner, Mrs. Alvarez, saved the day-old cinnamon rolls for Samuel and pretended not to notice when Annie studied behind the counter during slow hours. By her second year, Annie was volunteering at a legal aid clinic near downtown Oakland. Most of the work was ordinary: scanning documents, scheduling appointments, explaining which forms clients needed to bring. Yet those small tasks placed her beside people who had already been told no too many times. One afternoon, an elderly veteran named Mr. Lawson arrived with a letter denying part of his benefits. He had folded it into quarters and carried it in the breast pocket of his jacket for 3 weeks. "They say I missed a deadline," he told Annie. "But I mailed what they asked for." Annie read the letter twice. The deadline had not been missed. The agency had recorded the wrong date. She brought it to the supervising attorney, who filed an appeal. 2 months later, Mr. Lawson returned with a paper bag of oranges from his backyard. "For the young lady who actually read the letter," he said. Annie accepted 1 orange and left the rest for the office. That evening, she told Samuel about it over bowls of chicken soup. "You see," he said, "you're already practicing law. I scheduled an appointment and noticed a date. Most people lose because nobody notices the date." The experience stayed with her. So did the mother whose landlord had kept a security deposit without explanation, the nursing student pressured into signing a loan she did not understand, and the widower who nearly lost his home over a property tax notice he had been too embarrassed to admit he could not read. Annie began to understand that the law often appeared dramatic only after years of quiet mistakes. A missing signature. A number entered into the wrong column. A person who assumed no one would check. Near the end of her 3rd year, a professor recommended her for a competitive internship with Ellis & Cross, a San Francisco firm known for corporate compliance and nonprofit investigations. Margaret Ellis interviewed Annie herself. She was 55, with silver beginning to show in her close-cropped hair and reading glasses hanging from a thin chain around her neck. Her office contained no family photographs, only shelves of case files and a framed newspaper clipping about a housing discrimination lawsuit she had won 20 years earlier. "You have strong grades," Margaret said. "Thank you. You have good references." Annie waited. Margaret looked over the top of the resume. "Most applicants start talking when I pause." "I thought you were reading." "I was." Annie folded her hands in her lap. Margaret almost smiled. "Why corporate law? I'm interested in nonprofit oversight." "That is not the same thing." "No, ma'am." "So answer the question." Annie considered it. "Because large organizations can harm people without anyone inside believing they personally did anything wrong. I want to understand how that happens." Margaret set down the resume. "And you think the law prevents it?" "I think the law creates a record. Sometimes that is the first step." That answer is less idealistic than I expected. I've met too many people harmed by paperwork to be idealistic about paperwork. Margaret hired her. The internship was less glamorous than Annie's classmates imagined. She spent long days organizing contracts, checking corporate registrations, comparing board minutes, and correcting citations. Margaret returned assignments covered in notes. "Never write clearly unless the evidence is actually clear," she told Annie after crossing the word out 3 times. On another day, she handed back a memo with a single sentence circled. "You believe this conclusion?" "Yes." "Then prove it." I cited the statute. "The statute tells me the rule. It does not tell me these facts satisfy it." Annie rewrote the memo. Margaret did not praise her often, but she gave Annie increasingly difficult work. That was praise enough. One Monday morning, a senior associate placed 2 banker's boxes beside Annie's desk. "Vendor review," he said. "A client wants us to examine contracts connected to a charitable foundation. Start with Bright Path Consulting. Flag duplicate invoices, unusual payment terms, and anything that doesn't match the stated services." Annie opened the first box. The Whitmore Foundation name appeared across the top of the first contract. For a moment, she heard the hospital monitor again. She saw Samuel's watch in one hand and Charles's card in the other. She did not touch the card in her wallet. She read the contract. Bright Path Consulting had received payments for scholarship workshops in Sacramento, Fresno, and San Jose. Yet the invoices listed no venue addresses. Several carried identical descriptions and different dates. 2 used the same invoice number. Annie checked the company registration. BrightPath's business address was a private mailbox. She opened a spreadsheet listing scholarship recipients. 3 names appeared twice with different birth dates. Another name belonged to no enrolled student she could locate. Annie kept reading. By late afternoon, she had marked 17 irregularities. Then she found Charles Whitmore's electronic signature approving a transfer made on a date when a public news report placed him at a conference in London. She took the file to Margaret. "I'm not saying this proves fraud," Annie said, "but the records don't align." Margaret examined the pages without reacting. "What do you think it proves?" "That someone expected nobody to compare the dates." Margaret looked at her for a long moment, then pointed toward the chair. "Sit down. We're going through every document again." Before Annie could respond, the television mounted near the reception desk switched to breaking business news. A photograph of Charles Whitmore filled the screen. The anchor announced that Whitmore Industries was facing a federal financial inquiry, a sudden collapse in share value, and possible insolvency. Annie looked from the television to the signature in front of her. For 3 years, the business card in her wallet had reminded her of a man who had once noticed what others ignored. Now the document suggested someone had been counting on him, not noticing at all. The television continued speaking, but Annie no longer heard the anchor. Her attention remained on Charles Whitmore's electronic signature and the date beside it. Margaret muted the screen. "Start with what we know," she said. Annie placed the documents in order. BrightPath Consulting billed the foundation for scholarship workshops in 3 cities. The invoices do not list venues, instructors, or attendance records. 2 invoices share the same number, and several scholarship recipients appear more than once. What else? The company's registered address is a private mailbox. Mr. Whitmore's signature approved 1 transfer while he was in London. Margaret adjusted her glasses. A signature can be authorized remotely. Yes. So that fact alone proves nothing. I know. Margaret tapped the paper. Good. Never fall in love with your first theory. It will make you ignore anything that threatens it. Annie nodded. The senior associate who had delivered the boxes returned from the reception area. His name was Paul Mercer, and he had spent most of the morning treating the vendor review as routine work. "You saw the news?" he asked. Margaret unmuted the television. A reporter stood outside Whitmore Industries headquarters in Palo Alto. Employees moved through the glass doors behind her while a line of news vans filled the curb. Sources close to the board say emergency discussions are underway following allegations that funds from the Whitmore Foundation were diverted to conceal losses inside the parent company, the reporter said. Charles Whitmore has not made a public appearance since the inquiry was announced. The broadcast cut to Richard Whitmore standing before a bank of microphones. Annie recognized the family resemblance immediately. Richard had Charles's height and gray eyes, but his expression had been arranged for the cameras. "This is a painful day for our family," he said. "Our name has always stood for responsibility. If mistakes were made, we will correct them. If trust was violated, no individual, regardless of his position, can be placed above the institution." He never directly accused Charles. He did not have to. Paul folded his arms. "That sounds like the board is preparing to remove him, or someone wants the public to think they are," Annie said. Paul glanced at her. "We are reviewing vendor contracts, not solving a television mystery." Margaret looked at him. "At the moment, we are determining whether the records support the services billed, nothing more." She turned to Annie. "Continue the review. Do not contact anyone at the foundation. Do not remove documents. Do not discuss your connection to Mr. Whitmore with anyone outside this room." Paul frowned. "Connection?" Annie answered before Margaret could. "He helped my family 3 years ago." "What kind of help?" "A hospital bill." Paul looked from Annie to the screen. "That creates a problem." "It creates a disclosure," Margaret corrected. "Whether it becomes a conflict depends on the scope of our work." Annie felt heat rise into her face. "I can step away." "You may have to," Margaret said, "but not because Mr. Mercer looks uncomfortable." Paul picked up a folder and left without replying. For the next 2 hours, Annie worked through the scholarship database. She searched public enrollment records, university directories, archived foundation announcements, and social media pages where recipients had once thanked Whitmore Foundation. The newer spreadsheet listed 312 awards. Only 19 recipients had public evidence of receiving one. Annie printed an earlier version of the list from an archived board packet. This version contained different names: real students with schools, majors, hometowns, and signed acceptance forms. She placed the lists side by side. The scholarship amounts matched. The names did not. Someone had removed actual students and replaced them with fabricated recipients while leaving the total disbursement unchanged. Annie opened the first real file. Maria Alvarez, age 19, Fresno, nursing student, mother undergoing chemotherapy. The next belonged to Devin Cole, a single father studying electrical engineering in Sacramento. Another named Isaiah Turner had completed 4 years in the Marine Corps and planned to study physical therapy. Annie kept going. Near the bottom was Nia Franklin, 18, Richmond, California. Intended major, education. Her application essay described helping her younger brothers with homework at the kitchen table while their mother worked nights. Annie stopped reading. 3 years earlier, $5,000 had stood between her and the future she had planned. These students had done everything asked of them. They had completed applications, written essays, collected recommendations, and been selected. Then someone had erased their names and reported the money as paid. Margaret came to stand beside her. "What did you find?" Annie pointed to the 2 lists. The original recipients were replaced. "Can you prove the first list was approved?" "It appears in a board packet dated 6 weeks before the payments. Each student has an acceptance form. And the second? It was uploaded after the money moved." Margaret pulled over a chair. Annie showed her the metadata, payment dates, and altered names. The totals remain identical. Whoever changed the list wanted the accounting to balance. Margaret read Nia Franklin's application. How many real students disappeared? More than 300. The words settled between them. On the television, another analyst discussed the market value Whitmore Industries had lost since morning. The number ran into hundreds of millions. Annie looked at the list in front of her. Everyone keeps talking about the stock price. That is what business reporters measure. These students lost more than stockholders did. Margaret studied her. Be careful with comparisons. Loss is not a competition. I know, but a stockholder can recover money. Some of these students may never return to school. That is why we need facts strong enough to survive people who would prefer not to hear them. Paul returned with his phone in hand. Our client has instructed us to suspend the Bright Path review. Margaret's expression changed. Who gave the instruction? The General Counsel's office at the client organization. They said the contracts are now part of an internal investigation. Did they request the documents back? Yes. A courier is coming. Annie looked at the boxes. Paul continued. We are to preserve our work product, but stop all outside research. Margaret stood. Then that is what we will do. Annie stared at her. We're stopping? We are following the client's instruction. But the records show theft. They show irregularities. We have not interviewed witnesses, confirmed bank transfers, or authenticated every document. If we return these boxes, someone could destroy what remains. Margaret lowered her voice. And if you take one page without authorization, any case built from it may collapse. Your anger does not grant you ownership of someone else's records. Annie knew she was right. That did not make obedience easier. Together, they scanned the permitted notes, logged every page, and resealed the boxes. When the courier arrived, Annie watched him wheel them toward the elevator. By evening, the office had emptied. She sat alone at her desk, reading the list of students one more time from the copy authorized for the firm's file. Her phone displayed a news alert. Whitmore board to consider emergency removal of founder. A second alert followed. Foundation scholarships frozen during financial review. Annie pictured Nia Franklin opening an email informing her that the money was gone. She pictured Samuel in a hospital bed, blaming himself because she had postponed school. She remembered how close one unpaid balance had come to changing both their lives. She took Charles's business card from her wallet. For 3 years, she had obeyed his instruction. She had not called for work, money, or influence. Margaret appeared in the doorway with her coat over one arm. You are thinking about contacting him? Annie did not deny it. If I do nothing, hundreds of students lose their scholarships. If you act carelessly, they may lose the evidence as well. Then tell me what I can do. Margaret considered her for a moment. Tomorrow morning, we disclose your prior connection in writing. Then we determine whether any part of these records can be reported under our professional obligations. And if the client refuses, We do not steal. We do not threaten. We do not hold a press conference. Margaret picked up the list. We find a lawful door and make them explain why it should remain closed. Annie returned the card to her wallet. That night, she brought a copy of the public scholarship list home. Samuel sat at the kitchen table listening to a baseball game on the radio, his old watch lying beside a cup of black coffee. He noticed her expression and lowered the volume. What happened? Annie placed the list between them. The man who helped us may be in trouble, she said, and someone is stealing from students who may never get another chance. Samuel read several names before looking up. Do you know he is innocent? No. Do you know the students were cheated? I know their names were removed. I know the payments went somewhere else. Samuel leaned back in his chair. Then don't begin by trying to save a billionaire. Annie waited. Begin with the people whose names disappeared. She looked down at the list again. By morning, Annie understood what she had to do. She would not return to Charles as a grateful girl defending the man who once rescued her. She would return as someone carrying questions that powerful people had worked hard to bury. The next morning, Annie and Margaret left San Francisco before traffic thickened across the Bay Bridge. Margaret drove, one hand resting on the wheel, while Annie reviewed the disclosure letter in her lap. You understand what this does? Margaret asked. It tells Whitmore Industries that Mr. Whitmore helped my family 3 years ago, and that I may have a personal reason to care about the outcome. Margaret glanced at her. Caring is not the conflict. Hiding it would be. Annie folded the letter and placed it inside the file. Do you think they'll refuse to meet us? I think frightened organizations make unpredictable decisions. Some become honest. Others hire more lawyers. The headquarters of Whitmore Industries rose above a landscaped campus south of Palo Alto, its glass walls reflecting a pale California sky. News vans lined the entrance. Reporters stood behind temporary barriers, delivering updates while employees crossed the plaza with their heads down. A digital screen inside the lobby displayed the company's stock price. The number changed every few seconds, each drop followed by another red arrow. Annie had expected the building to feel powerful. Instead, it felt like a place holding its breath. A security officer inspected their identification before directing them to reception. The woman behind the desk wore a headset and spoke to 3 people at once. We have an appointment with Daniel Cross, Margaret said. The receptionist checked her screen. Miss Ellis is listed. I don't see anyone else. Annie Brooks is attending as part of my review team. The receptionist looked at Annie's plain navy suit and the file in her hands. Are you delivering documents? No, Annie said. I helped review them. The woman looked back at Margaret. Mr. Cross's office requested senior counsel only. Margaret did not raise her voice. Then please tell Mr. Cross that senior counsel will not be attending without the person who identified the irregularities. The receptionist hesitated. Annie reached into her wallet and removed Charles's business card. It was worn along the edges and looked out of place against the polished stone counter. I also need Mr. Whitmore to know I'm here. The receptionist picked up the card. This is an old design. It's 3 years old. Do you have a current relationship with Mr. Whitmore? No. Then I can't send you upstairs based on this. Annie held the woman's gaze. 3 years ago, Mr. Whitmore paid the hospital balance that kept my grandfather under cardiac care. He told me to contact him only when I was ready to help someone else. I have evidence that money intended for hundreds of students has disappeared. Please tell him Annie Brooks is downstairs. The receptionist's expression changed, though only slightly. She made a call and spoke too quietly for Annie to hear. While they waited, a group of employees passed through the lobby. One man said the board had canceled a scheduled product launch. Another asked whether payroll was safe. Nobody seemed to know. 5 minutes later, the elevator doors opened. A tall man with gray hair and a legal pad under one arm stepped out. Annie recognized Daniel Cross from the firm's background research. Margaret, he said, shaking her hand. I was told you brought a junior member of your staff. I brought the person who found the problem. Daniel looked at Annie. Miss Brooks? Yes, sir. The disclosure letter mentioned a prior financial benefit from Mr. Whitmore. It was not a benefit connected to my work. That will be for us to assess. Margaret stepped between them without moving. You may assess it after you hear what she found. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he gestured toward the elevators. Come upstairs. As the elevator rose, Annie watched the floors pass on the display. 3 years earlier, She had stood in a hospital hallway with flour on her sleeves. Now she carried documents that might determine whether the man who had helped her kept control of his company. The doors opened onto an executive floor, crowded with assistants and attorneys. Phones rang behind glass walls. Boxes of records sat outside conference rooms. Daniel led them into a smaller meeting room. Charles Whitmore stood near the window with his back to the door. He appeared older than Annie remembered. His shoulders were still straight, but exhaustion showed in the lines around his eyes. A television behind him displayed silent footage of Richard speaking to reporters. Charles turned. His eyes moved from Margaret to Annie without recognition. Daniel said there may be evidence involving the foundation. There is, Margaret replied. But Miss Brooks should explain how we found it. Annie placed the old business card on the table. Charles looked down at it. Street Matthew Medical Center, she said. My grandfather, Samuel Brooks. Recognition came slowly, then all at once. The young woman working 2 jobs. Yes, sir. How is your grandfather? He still drinks coffee his cardiologist would object to, but he's alive. For the first time, Charles's expression softened. And school? I went back. You studied law? I'm completing my undergraduate program and working as a legal intern. Charles looked at the files in her hands. Then you kept your promise. I'm still working on it. Daniel pulled out a chair. We should focus on the documents. They sat. Annie explained Bright Path Consulting, the duplicate invoices, the private mailbox, and the conflicting scholarship lists. She placed the original recipients beside the altered records. These students were approved, she said. Their acceptance forms are in the earlier board packet. 6 weeks later, their names disappeared, but the payment totals stayed the same. Charles turned the pages. Who authorized the changes? We don't know yet, Annie replied, but someone used your electronic signature while you were attending a conference in London. I authorized transactions remotely. Then we need the access records, the device history, and the delegation file. Daniel studied the signature. Those records are held by Foundation Administration. Vivian's office, Charles said. The conference room door opened before anyone could respond. Richard Whitmore entered without knocking. He wore a dark suit and the calm expression of a man arriving at a meeting he believed he controlled. Charles, the board is waiting for. He stopped when he saw Annie. Who is this? Annie Brooks, Charles said. She identified irregularities in the scholarship accounts. Richard smiled at her. The girl from the hospital. Annie's back stiffened. I'm part of the legal review team. Of course. His tone remained pleasant. It's admirable when someone who benefited from Charles's generosity finds a way to return the favor. I'm not here to return a favor. No? Annie turned the list of names toward him. I'm here because more than 300 students were promised scholarships. The money was reported as paid, but they never received it. Richard barely glanced at the page. Foundations make administrative corrections every year. That does not make them crimes. No, Annie said. Creating fake recipients and billing for events that never happened might. Daniel interrupted. We have not reached a legal conclusion. Richard looked at Charles. You're allowing an intern with a personal attachment to participate in an internal investigation? Margaret answered. Under licensed supervision and with full disclosure. This company is losing millions by the hour. We do not have time for sentimental investigations based on clerical errors. Annie saw Charles hesitate. Richard noticed it too. She leaned forward. Mr. Whitmore, I didn't come here because I think one good act makes you incapable of wrongdoing. If these records lead to you, I will follow them there. Charles met her eyes. Then why come at all? He asked. Because the public has already decided this is about whether a billionaire keeps his company. Annie touched the list. It isn't. It's about whether these students keep their future. Silence settled over the room. Charles pulled the remaining files toward him, then looked at Daniel. Open an independent review. Full access to the foundation contracts, scholarship records, and signature logs. Richard's expression hardened. The board will object. Then the board can object in writing. Charles turned to Annie. You once told me poor families sign papers they don't understand. I remember. He placed the altered list on top of the file. Then show me where the truth begins. Daniel Cross did not begin the review until everyone in the conference room understood the limits. Miss Brooks is not licensed to practice law, he said. She will not interview witnesses alone, issue legal conclusions, or remove documents from company custody. Every request goes through me or Miss Ellis. Annie nodded. Understood. Richard leaned back in his chair. Then perhaps we should let the attorneys handle it. Margaret closed the folder in front of her. The attorneys are handling it. Annie is handling the data. Charles looked at Daniel. What do you need? Foundation contracts for the last 3 years. Vendor, payment records, scholarship files, access logs for your electronic signature, and the minutes from every board meeting where Bright Path was discussed. Richard's expression remained calm. That is a broad request. So is $18 million, Annie said. Daniel glanced at her. She corrected herself. Potentially $18 million, based on the vendor totals we've reviewed so far. Richard gave a thin smile. At least the intern can be trained. Charles pushed back from the table. Daniel gets full access. No department delays him. No records are to be destroyed, altered, or removed. I'll notify the board, Richard said. You'll notify them after Daniel preserves the records. For the first time, Richard's smile disappeared. The review began that afternoon in a secured conference room on the 9th floor. 2 forensic accountants joined the team. Margaret examined contracts and board resolutions. Daniel handled privilege issues and internal authorizations. Annie built a timeline across a whiteboard that soon filled with dates, vendor names, invoice numbers, and payment amounts. Bright Path Consulting had not been the only recipient. There were 6 related companies, each registered within months of one another. One provided student mentoring services, another billed for community outreach assessments, a third claimed to have developed an online scholarship portal that no one on the foundation staff could locate. The companies had different names, but their payments followed the same pattern. Each invoice remained just below the amount that required a second board approval. They split the contracts, Annie said. One of the accountants, Leonard Park, looked up from his laptop. It could be normal project separation, except the descriptions are identical. Leonard compared the documents. Same wording, same punctuation error. Margaret leaned over his shoulder. And different approvers? Vivian Whitmore signed most of them. Daniel made a note. That establishes oversight, not intent. Annie studied the dates. The payments increase near the end of every quarter. Leonard checked the ledger. She's right. Why would that matter? Charles asked. To make the foundation appear as if it was meeting its annual distribution targets, Annie said. The money leaves on paper before anyone has time to verify the services. Charles looked at the total on the screen. $18.4 million, Leonard said. Over 32 months. No one spoke for several seconds. Charles had spent his career discussing larger amounts without visible emotion. This number affected him differently. How many scholarships would that have funded? He asked. Annie had already calculated it. Depending on the award size, between 700 and 900 students. Charles lowered his gaze. Richard had left the meeting. But Vivian Whitmore arrived before dinner with 2 assistants and a folder of prepared statements. She was in her early 60s, dressed in cream-colored wool despite the warm day. I understand my department is being treated like a crime scene, she said. Daniel stood. We are conducting an independent review, authorized by the founder. Vivian looked at Annie. And she is independent? My connection has been disclosed, Annie said. I'm aware of your story. Charles helped your family. He helped my grandfather receive medical care. And now you've come to protect him. I came because scholarship funds are missing. Vivian placed her folder on the table. Nothing is missing. Nonprofit accounting is more complex than a college spreadsheet. Annie resisted the urge to respond immediately. Margaret had warned her that silence could be more useful than indignation. Daniel opened one of the contracts. Can you identify the venue used for this Sacramento workshop? Vivian glanced at the page. I don't manage event logistics. Who does? My program directors. We've spoken with both. Neither remembers the event. Then speak with someone more competent. Leonard slid another invoice forward. Bright Path billed for 200 attendees. Then 200 people attended. There are no registrations, catering receipts, rental agreements, or travel reimbursements. Vivian's voice cooled. Are you accusing me of fraud? No, Daniel said. We're asking you to explain the records. Vivian turned to Charles. You are allowing strangers to humiliate me in your own building. Charles had remained near the window. They asked for a location, Vivian. You know what the foundation has accomplished. I know what we reported. Her face tightened. After everything I've done for this family, you're taking the word of a 21-year-old intern over mine? Annie saw Charles flinch at the word family. He looked toward her as if expecting support. She gave him none. That was not why she was there. Answer the question, Charles said. Vivian gathered her papers. I will respond through counsel. She walked out with both assistants following. The room remained quiet after the door closed. Charles looked at Annie. You believe she stole the money? I believe she approved payments that cannot yet be supported. That isn't what I asked. No, sir. Charles turned from the window. You came here because of what I did for you. You know almost nothing about my family. Annie felt Margaret watching her, but she did not look away. I know someone used your foundation to erase hundreds of students. You don't know what Vivian has done for this company, and you don't know what she did with $18 million. Charles's expression hardened. Be careful. Annie lowered her voice. A person can share your blood and still betray everything you believe in. You're speaking from very little experience. I'm speaking from the records. The tension held until Daniel stepped between them. We need the electronic signature logs. Charles looked away first. That evening, the review team relocated to Charles's home in Hillsborough, where the company's legal department had secured a private workspace away from reporters. Eleanor Price, the longtime house manager, brought coffee and sandwiches into the library. She placed a cup near Annie. You take it black? With a little milk, please. Eleanor poured it without comment, then glanced toward Charles, who stood alone near the fireplace. He has spent most of his life hoping generosity could turn relatives into family, she said quietly. Annie looked at her. Eleanor adjusted the tray. Some people only learn the difference after the money is gone. Before Annie could ask what she meant, Daniel called from across the room. We have the signature logs. The team gathered around his laptop. Charles's electronic approval had been used 17 times during the period under review. 6 transactions occurred while he was traveling. One had been authorized at 3:14 a.m., California time, while Charles was delivering a keynote address in London. Daniel opened the device record. The signature came from your backup laptop. Charles frowned. That laptop stays in my home office. Eleanor stopped beside the doorway. Not always, she said. Everyone turned toward her. She looked at Charles. Mr. Richard carried it out of your study one night last winter. You were in Europe. Charles stared at her. Why didn't you tell me? You had told the staff he was permitted to use the study. Did he say why he needed the laptop? No, sir. Eleanor's hands tightened around the tray. But he was not alone. Charles stepped away from the fireplace. Who was with him? Eleanor set the tray down before answering. A woman from the foundation and a man I didn't recognize. I saw them from the upstairs landing. Mr. Richard told me they were reviewing donor records. Was the woman Vivian? No, sir. She was younger. Daniel opened a blank page on his legal pad. Can you describe either of them? The man was in his 40s, perhaps. Dark hair, blue tie, silver briefcase. The woman wore a foundation badge, but I couldn't read her name. When did this happen? Margaret asked. Last December, the Tuesday before Mr. Whitmore returned from London. Annie looked toward the electronic signature log. The largest transfer to Bright Path had been authorized that same week. Do you keep a record of visitors? She asked. Eleanor's eyes moved to Charles before returning to Annie. The security system does. Daniel shook his head. The digital visitor records for that period are missing. I keep my own book. Charles frowned. Since when? Since your father was alive. She spoke without apology. Computers fail. People change passwords. Paper remains where you leave it. Where is it? Daniel asked. In the service office. Charles looked at the clock. It was nearly 9. Bring it in the morning. Eleanor studied him. Yes, sir. Annie noticed the disappointment in her face. She had offered something important, and Charles had postponed it as though they were discussing another report. Margaret noticed too. We should stop for the evening, she said. Everyone is tired, and tired people make careless conclusions. Charles looked at the files covering his library table. We don't have the luxury of rest. No, Margaret replied. We have the necessity of accuracy. Before Charles could argue, Eleanor said, Mr. Brooks and Miss Annie have not eaten. Annie glanced toward the sandwiches. I'm fine. Eleanor gave her the same look Nurse Reynolds had used 3 years earlier. That answer is not improved by repetition. Samuel had been waiting in the small sitting room near the kitchen. Annie had asked him to stay with her while the review continued because she did not want him alone in Oakland after the first reports appeared. He had objected until Margaret reminded him that temporary caution was not surrender. When Annie entered, he was examining a framed photograph of Charles beside a much younger Richard. "That your billionaire?" Samuel asked. "He has a name. So do hurricanes. Grandpa." Samuel put the photograph down. "I'm reserving judgment." Eleanor appeared in the doorway. "Dinner is ready." "I already ate," Samuel said. "You had crackers at 6. That counts at my age." "It does not count at any age." The dining room table could seat 14 people, yet only 5 places had been set. Charles entered last, still reading a message on his phone. Eleanor removed the phone from his place setting and put it on a side table. Charles stared at her. "You invited guests," she said. "They should not have to compete with your board of directors." Samuel hid a smile. Dinner was simple by Charles's standards. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and cornbread. Annie recognized the menu and looked toward Eleanor. "Mr. Brooks mentioned what he likes," Eleanor said. Samuel settled into the chair beside Charles, instead of taking the seat at the far end. Charles noticed, most people choose the head of the table. Most people like shouting across furniture. For the first few minutes, they ate in silence. Charles seemed uncertain how to speak without a meeting agenda between them. Samuel solved the problem. "My granddaughter says you saved my life." Charles set down his fork. "The doctors did that. You paid the bill that kept me with those doctors. I covered a balance. $5,000 is more than a balance to people who don't have it." Charles glanced at Annie. She said something similar. Samuel nodded. "Then she was raised properly." Annie gave him a warning look. "What?" he asked. "I'm allowed 1 compliment a month." Charles almost smiled. Samuel leaned back carefully. "I owe you thanks, Mr. Whitmore. But Annie does not owe you her loyalty, her career, or her silence. I never asked for any of those." "Good. Then we understand each other." Annie looked at Charles, expecting offense. Instead, he nodded. "We do." Samuel studied the room. "You live here alone?" "Eleanor and the staff are here." "That wasn't my question." Charles looked down the length of the table. Most of the chairs remained empty. "My family visits when there is business to discuss." "When was the last time they came without discussing money?" Charles did not answer. Samuel cut into the cornbread. "Blood makes relatives. Conduct makes family." No one spoke for a moment. Annie thought of Richard carrying Charles's laptop out of the study while Charles was overseas. She thought of Vivian asking why a young intern's questions should matter more than years of family trust. Charles looked toward the empty chairs. "I spent a long time believing that if I gave them enough responsibility, they would eventually feel responsible for something besides themselves." Samuel nodded. "That is an expensive lesson." After dinner, Annie and Charles returned to the library. Daniel and Margaret had left, but Leonard had emailed updated loan records before going home. Annie opened the files on a secured laptop. "What are you looking for?" Charles asked. "The missing money explains part of the crisis, but not all of it. $18 million doesn't bring down a company your size." Charles pulled a chair beside her. "The banks are concerned about covenant violations." "Who negotiated the loans?" "Richard led the finance committee." Annie compared the agreements. Several contained clauses allowing lenders to demand early repayment if Whitmore Industries' share price remained below a set threshold for 10 consecutive trading days. "Were these terms normal?" she asked. "For a company in distress, perhaps. But Whitmore wasn't in distress when you signed them." Charles read the dates. "No, the interest rates were higher than comparable corporate loans." More troubling, each lender had ties to a private investment group called North Valley Capital. Annie searched the state business registry. North Valley shared an attorney with 2 of the Bright Path companies. She turned the screen toward Charles. "If the stock keeps falling, these loans come due. If the company can't pay, the lenders can force asset sales." Charles's face changed as he read. "North Valley made an offer last month to purchase our medical technology division." "Who presented the offer to the board?" "Richard." The scheme widened before them. The scholarships had not been stolen only for personal spending. The missing funds weakened the foundation, the scandal weakened Charles, and the loans placed the company where outside buyers could acquire its assets cheaply. Annie said, "Vivian may have approved the false contracts, but someone designed this beyond the foundation." Charles stared at the loan documents. "Richard has been beside me since the company had 12 employees. That doesn't change the terms he negotiated." You think he planned all of this? I think the records are asking us to consider it. Charles stood and walked to the window. Beyond the glass, the lights of the Bay Area stretched across the darkness. My father used to say Richard wanted the reward before he understood the work. Did you believe him? I thought he was trying to turn us against each other. And now? Charles did not answer. Eleanor appeared at the library door holding a worn leather ledger. You said tomorrow morning, she told him, but I decided the truth should not be asked to wait for breakfast. She placed the visitor book beside Annie's laptop and opened it to the week Charles had been in London. 3 names appeared beneath Richard's signature. One belonged to an executive at North Valley Capital. Another belonged to a Bright Path director. The third belonged to Vivian Whitmore. Charles read the page twice. Then Eleanor pointed to a note in the margin. Mr. Richard asked security to disable the hallway camera for a private family meeting. Annie looked at Charles. The betrayal no longer appeared as a theory on a whiteboard. It had entered his home, used his office, and carried his name through the front door. Charles kept his eyes on the visitor ledger. Richard's signature appeared at the top of the page, followed by the names of Vivian Whitmore, a Bright Path director, and an executive from North Valley Capital. The meeting had taken place 4 days before Charles's electronic signature approved the largest transfer from the scholarship fund. Daniel returned to the house before midnight after Charles called him. Margaret arrived 20 minutes later, carrying her laptop and a legal pad. Neither commented on the hour. Daniel photographed each page of the ledger, then placed the book inside an evidence envelope. Mrs. Price, I need you to tell me only what you personally saw, he said, not what you believe happened. Eleanor sat across from him in the library. I understand. Did you see Mr. Richard use the laptop? No, I saw him carry it out of the study. Was it open? It was closed. Did you hear any part of the meeting? No. Did anyone tell you why the hallway camera was disabled? Mr. Richard said the family required privacy. Did Mr. Whitmore authorize that? Not to my knowledge. Daniel wrote without looking up. Have you discussed this with anyone other than the people in this room? No. Margaret watched Eleanor carefully. Why did you keep a separate visitor book? Mr. Whitmore's father once lost 6 months of household records after a security system failure. He blamed the staff. After that, I wrote down every visitor myself. Charles shifted near the fireplace. My father blamed people before he blamed machines. Eleanor looked at him. He often blamed people before he blamed himself. The remark could have ended another employee's career. Charles only nodded. Daniel sealed the evidence envelope. This supports access and opportunity. It does not yet prove Richard authorized the transfers. Annie looked at the visitor names. But it gives us a reason to request communications between Richard, Vivian, Bright Path, and North Valley. If the board approves it, Daniel said, Richard controls the board agenda now. Then we seek preservation through outside counsel and, if necessary, the court. Charles picked up his phone. I'll call the board members tonight. Margaret stopped him. No, this is my company, and Richard may already expect you to react. If he knows we have the ledger, other records could disappear. Charles lowered the phone. Margaret continued. We preserve quietly. We identify where the data is stored. Then we act before anyone knows which evidence we have. Annie noticed how difficult silence was for Charles. He had built his life by making decisions quickly. Now the safest decision was to wait. The team worked until after 2 in the morning. By then, Daniel had drafted preservation notices for the company's technology department, North Valley Capital, and each vendor connected to Bright Path. Margaret arranged for an independent forensic firm to collect copies of the relevant servers at sunrise. Annie left the Whitmore estate shortly after 3. Charles offered a driver, but she declined. I came in my own car. You haven't slept. Neither have you. That is not a defense. I'll stop for coffee. That is worse. Margaret stepped in. She can follow me back to San Francisco, Annie agreed. Though she intended to turn east toward Oakland once they reached the highway. The roads were nearly empty. Margaret's taillight stayed ahead of her until they crossed into San Francisco. Annie then took the exit toward the Bay Bridge. A black SUV followed her through the toll plaza. At first, she thought little of it. Several cars were heading east. When she changed lanes, the SUV changed lanes. When she slowed, it remained behind her. Annie checked the rearview mirror again. She could not see the driver's face. She left the freeway 2 exits before her usual one. The SUV followed. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel. She remembered something Samuel had taught her when she began driving. If you think someone is following you, never lead them home. Annie turned toward an Oakland police station and pulled into the well-lit parking lot. The SUV continued past without slowing. She remained in the car for several minutes before calling Margaret. Someone followed me from the bridge. Are you safe? I'm outside a police station. Stay there, I'm coming back. You're already in San Francisco. I did not ask where I am. I asked you to stay there. Annie reported the vehicle, though she had only a partial license plate. An officer took her statement and advised her to vary her route. Margaret arrived 40 minutes later. You should have accepted the driver, she said. I know. Say it again so I can enjoy it. I should have accepted the driver. Margaret nodded. Better. By the time Annie reached her apartment, dawn had begun to lighten the sky. Samuel was still staying with an old friend, so the rooms should have been empty. The front door was unlocked. Annie stopped before touching it. Margaret pulled her back and called the police. 2 officers entered first. The apartment had been searched with purpose. Drawers were open, books had been removed from shelves, and the mattress had been lifted. A jar containing emergency cash remained untouched. So did the television and Samuel's old radio. Annie's laptop was gone. The notebook she used for the investigation had also disappeared. Did you keep confidential client information here? Margaret asked. No. Only my own notes and public records. Passwords? The laptop is encrypted. Good. An officer asked whether anything else was missing. Annie checked the desk. Her college files remained. Charles's business card was still inside her wallet. They wanted the investigation, she said. Not my property. Margaret's face tightened. From now on, you do not travel alone. Annie wanted to object, but did not. By noon, Charles had learned what happened. He arrived at the apartment with Daniel and 2 private security officers. Samuel returned soon afterward, angry that no one had told him before he saw the police car outside. Charles stood in the small living room, looking at the open drawers. This ends now, he said. Annie turned from the desk. What ends? Your involvement. No. Someone followed you and entered your home. That means we're close to something. It means you are in danger. So are the students whose money was stolen. They are not being followed across the Bay Bridge. Annie folded her arms. What are you proposing? You leave the review. I'll cover the rest of your education and arrange security for your grandfather. The room went still. Samuel looked toward Annie but did not interrupt. She stared at Charles. You're trying to solve fear with money again. I'm trying to keep you alive. By asking me to walk away, Larry done more than anyone could expect. That is not the point. It is exactly the point. You owe me nothing. Annie stepped closer. Kindness should never purchase silence. Charles's expression hardened. Do not turn this into something it is not. Then stop treating me like the frightened girl you met in a hospital. I'm treating you like a 21-year-old whose apartment was just broken into. And I'm telling you that the people who did this want me to quit. That does not mean you have to prove them wrong with your life. No. It means I have to decide whether fear gets to make the decision for me. Charles looked toward Samuel, perhaps expecting support. Samuel spoke quietly. She is old enough to choose. Your job is not to choose for her. My job is to protect the people I brought into this. Annie shook her head. You didn't bring me into it. The missing names did. Daniel's phone rang before Charles could answer. He stepped into the hallway, then returned with his face drawn. What happened? Margaret asked. Daniel turned the screen toward them. An online article had been published minutes earlier. The headline identified Annie as a former recipient of Charles Whitmore's personal financial assistance and suggested she had used the connection to gain access to the company's internal investigation. The article included the name of Street Matthew Medical Center, the amount Charles had paid, and a photograph of Annie entering the Whitmore estate. Samuel read the headline twice. They turned the hospital into evidence against her, he said. Margaret took the phone. Only a small number of people knew the amount. Mrs. Keller, Annie said. Nurse Reynolds, Charles, me, and anyone with access to the Foundation's private background files, Daniel added. Charles looked at the photograph of Annie on the screen. The attack was no longer hidden inside contracts and false invoices. Someone had decided that destroying her credibility would be easier than disproving what she had found. Annie closed the article and handed the phone back. They want the public to believe I came for money. Charles looked at her. Then we keep you out of public view until we can respond. No, Annie said. We find out who gave them the story. She looked around the apartment at the open drawers and scattered papers. And then we find out what they were afraid I had already found. By late afternoon, the article had spread beyond business news. Cable hosts repeated the same photograph of Annie entering Charles's estate, while online commentators treated speculation as fact. One headline called her a grateful student who had become too close to her benefactor. Another described her as an inexperienced intern with unusual access to a billionaire under investigation. A television panel debated whether Charles's generosity had compromised his judgment. No one mentioned the missing scholarship recipients. Margaret closed the laptop. Stop reading. They're using the same sentences, Annie said. Different websites, same language. Daniel looked up from his phone. That usually means someone distributed talking points. Charles stood near the apartment window, watching the street below. 2 reporters had already arrived outside the building. Security will move you and Samuel somewhere else tonight, he said. Samuel shook his head. I'm not leaving my home because strangers have poor manners. This is more than poor manners, Charles replied. Someone entered Annie's apartment, and the police are handling it. The police cannot stand beside you every hour. Samuel looked at him. Neither can your money. Annie heard the tension rising and stepped between them. Grandpa, this isn't the time to prove a point. I'm not proving anything. You're refusing help because you don't like being told what to do. Samuel folded his arms. That sounds familiar. Before Annie could answer, the phone on the kitchen wall rang. Samuel reached it first. Brooks' residence. His expression changed. Annie moved closer. Who is it? Samuel said nothing. He listened for several seconds, then hung up. What did they say? Margaret asked. Samuel looked toward Annie. Wrong number. The phone rang again. This time Annie answered. A man's voice said, Tell the old man accidents happen when people don't know when to stay quiet. The line went dead. Annie kept the receiver against her ear. Charles crossed the room. What did he say? She repeated the words. Samuel's jaw tightened, but the color had left his face. Margaret called the police while Daniel contacted the company's security director. Charles did not ask again whether Samuel would leave. He simply told the security team to prepare a private residence in Marin County owned by the company. Samuel objected until Annie turned on him. If you stay here, I stay too. You have work to do. Then come with us. This is my home, and you're the person they threatened because of me. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. Not because of you. Because of what they did. That doesn't change the danger. No, but it changes where the blame belongs. Annie's voice weakened. Please. That ended the argument. Samuel packed one small suitcase, 3 medication bottles, his radio, and the old wristwatch he had worn for decades. Before leaving, he stood in the doorway and looked back at the apartment. I spent 27 years paying for this place, he said. I don't appreciate being chased out of it. Charles stood beside him. You're not being chased out. You're leaving long enough to come back safely. Samuel glanced at him. That sounded like something a man tells himself when he dislikes the word afraid. Charles accepted the judgment without replying. The security team drove Samuel and Annie to a modest house near Mill Valley. It belonged to Whitmore Industries but looked nothing like Charles's estate. The kitchen had oak cabinets, a refrigerator covered with old maintenance stickers, and a narrow porch facing a wooded hillside. Samuel switched on his radio and found a baseball game. You settle quickly, Annie said. I'm old. We learned to carry home in smaller pieces. She sat across from him at the kitchen table. Her phone continued vibrating with messages from reporters, classmates, and numbers she did not recognize. One message contained a photograph of Samuel leaving the apartment. Another said Annie had manipulated Charles from the beginning. She turned the phone face down. I should stop, she said. Samuel lowered the radio. If I step away, maybe they leave you alone, and maybe they steal the rest of the money. The lawyers can continue without me. They can. Annie waited for him to tell her she was necessary. He did not. That's all you're going to say? Samuel took off his watch and placed it on the table between them. You want me to tell you nobody else can do this? That would make the decision easier. She looked down. But Margaret is a better lawyer than you, he continued. Daniel knows the company. Charles has power you don't have. They can continue. Then I should leave. Maybe. Annie looked at him, frustrated. You told me not to let fear decide. I told you not to confuse love with disappearing. Staying in a fight for the wrong reason is another way to disappear. She touched the watch. What is the right reason? You tell me. Annie thought about Charles in the hospital hallway. She thought about Nia Franklin, Isaiah Turner, and the hundreds of names removed from the scholarship list. At first, I wanted to help him because he helped us. Samuel nodded. Now I want to know where the money went. Why? Because those students earned those scholarships. Someone decided they would be easier to erase than wealthy people. Samuel pushed the watch toward her. Then don't stay for Charles. Stay for the names. She picked it up. The second hand moved across the scratched face, still 5 minutes behind the clock on the wall. Truth may arrive late, Samuel said, but don't let it stop. The following morning, Annie returned to the secured review room with 2 guards stationed outside. Margaret had already prepared a list of media claims and compared them with information known only to the Foundation. The exact hospital amount came from a private background memorandum, she said. Vivian's office requested it after you joined the review. Daniel placed a printed access report on the table. Her communications director downloaded the file 2 hours before the article appeared. Charles looked at the record. Suspend the director's access. Already done, Daniel said. Annie opened the Foundation archive. If Vivian leaked the story, she expected us to focus on defending me. Margaret nodded. So we do the opposite. They returned to the contracts. Annie searched the deleted files recovered by the forensic team. Most were incomplete drafts and calendar notices. One audio file had no title, only a date matching a meeting held 3 months earlier. She played it. At first, there was only the scrape of chairs and distant conversation. Then Vivian's voice became clear. The approved student list is creating delays, she said. Replace it with the administrative roster. A man asked, what happens to the original recipients? They receive postponement notices. They were already promised funding. Vivian's reply came without hesitation. Promises are not payments. Remove the names before the quarterly report is finalized. The room fell silent. Annie replayed the final sentence. Charles sat down slowly. Daniel reached for the keyboard. We need the full recording authenticated. Margaret looked at Annie. This can support suspension and expand the investigation. It does not yet connect Richard. No, Annie said. But Vivian just admitted the students were removed deliberately. Charles stared at the list beside the computer. For the first time, the missing names were no longer an accounting irregularity. They were a decision. The recording was authenticated before noon. Daniel had the forensic team confirm the file's creation date, recover its metadata, and compare Vivian's voice with public interviews and internal meeting recordings. By 3 o'clock, he was willing to put his name beneath the conclusion. The audio has not been edited, he said. The device that recorded it belonged to the Foundation's conference system. The original file was deleted from the active server but remained in an automatic backup. Charles stood at the end of the review table, reading the report. Is it enough to remove her? Temporarily, Daniel replied. The board can suspend her pending a full investigation. It is not enough by itself to prove she received the money. Margaret closed the folder. It proves the scholarship list was deliberately altered. That gives us grounds to preserve her records and stop further transfers. Annie looked at the names spread across the table. How soon can the board meet? Charles checked his watch. They're already being called. The emergency meeting began at 5 in the executive boardroom. Outside the glass walls, the sun was lowering over the Santa Cruz Mountains, but no one in the room paid attention to the view. 12 directors sat around the long table. Legal counsel occupied one side, while 2 forensic accountants waited near a screen displaying the payment timeline. Vivian arrived last. She wore a gray suit and carried no notes. Richard entered beside her, his face arranged into concern. He took his seat near Charles and placed one hand briefly on his brother's shoulder. We will get through this, he said. Charles looked at the hand until Richard removed it. Daniel opened the meeting by explaining that the review remained preliminary. Margaret then described how BrightPath and 5 related vendors had received more than $18 million through contracts that lacked supporting records. Vivian listened without interrupting. When the recording played, the room changed. Her own voice filled the speakers. The approved student list is creating delays. Replace it with the administrative roster. Then came the question about the original recipients. Vivian's answer followed. Promises are not payments. Remove the names before the quarterly report is finalized. When the audio ended, no one spoke. Charles looked directly at her. Did you say those words? Vivian folded her hands. The recording lacks context. What context makes removing 300 approved students acceptable? There were compliance concerns. Which concerns? Some files were incomplete. Annie glanced at Margaret, who gave a small nod. Under supervision, Annie placed the original scholarship list on the screen. Every student shown here had a completed application, an acceptance form, proof of enrollment, and a signed award notice, she said. The replacement list was uploaded after the funds were transferred. Most of the substitute recipients have no enrollment records. One board member leaned forward. Who created the replacement list? The file was uploaded through the executive office of the foundation, Annie said. Vivian's eyes narrowed. A department with more than 40 employees. The access credentials belong to your administrative account, which several people used. Daniel intervened. That will be examined separately. Richard turned toward Vivian with an expression of practiced disappointment. Why didn't you bring these compliance concerns to the board? I did. When? In program reviews. I attended those reviews, Richard said. You never disclosed that approved recipients had been removed. Vivian stared at him. Annie saw the moment she understood what he was doing. Richard was not defending her. He was separating himself from her before the board could connect them. Vivian's voice sharpened. You were aware of every restructuring decision. I was aware that you were modernizing administration. I was not aware you were replacing real students with false records. That is a lie. Richard lowered his eyes as though the accusation saddened him. This meeting is being recorded, Vivian. Charles watched them both. Enough. Daniel, what action do you recommend? Immediate suspension of Miss Whitmore's authority, preservation of all foundation accounts, and referral of the evidence to outside investigators. A director near the far end of the table raised her hand. What happens to current scholarship payments? They remain frozen until we verify the recipients, Daniel said. Annie spoke before she could stop herself. Some students have tuition deadlines this week. Several directors looked at her. Margaret touched Annie's arm, reminding her of the room's rules. Charles said, establish an emergency verification team. Legitimate awards should not be delayed because we failed to supervise the foundation. Richard nodded quickly. I support that. The motion to suspend Vivian passed 10 votes to 2. Vivian did not look at Charles as she stood. She looked only at Richard. You will regret this, she said. Richard remained seated. I already regret that our family has come to this. Security escorted her from the room. Within an hour, the board issued a statement announcing her suspension and the recovery of scholarship records. Reporters outside the building treated the development as proof that the crisis had been contained. Whitmore Industries' share price rose 6% before the market closed. Employees gathered around lobby screens. Some applauded. Others called family members to say the company might survive. Charles returned to the review room and removed his jacket. We found the person who controlled the false records, he said. Annie remained at the whiteboard. We found one person. He looked at her. You heard the recording. I also watched Richard blame her for everything before anyone asked what he knew. Richard has been cooperating. He knew which questions to answer before Daniel asked them. Margaret sat at the table, reviewing the minutes. Suspicion is not evidence. I know. Charles sounded tired. Then stop treating it like a conclusion. Annie pointed to the loan timeline. Vivian controlled the foundation. She did not negotiate these loans. She did not introduce North Valley to the board. She did not benefit from forcing the company into an asset sale. You don't know what she benefited from. Neither do you. That's why stopping with her is dangerous. Charles's patience broke. For 3 days, you have questioned my judgment, my family, and every decision I made regarding this foundation. Vivian has now been removed. The student records are being restored. Allow us one evening to recognize progress. Annie held his gaze. Progress is not the same as the truth. Charles turned away. Richard entered carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of sparkling water. I thought we could use something stronger, he said. But Daniel would probably object. No one laughed. Richard poured a glass for Charles. The board is relieved. You may have saved the company today. Charles accepted the water but did not drink. Richard looked at Annie. And you helped expose a serious failure. I owe you an apology. For what? For questioning whether your personal history affected your work. Annie studied him. It does affect my work. Richard appeared surprised. It reminds me what a scholarship means when someone cannot replace it, she continued. It does not change the records. A fair distinction, he said. His tone was respectful now. But Annie trusted it less than his earlier contempt. That night, she returned to the temporary house in Mill Valley. Samuel was asleep in an armchair with the radio playing quietly beside him. Annie covered him with a blanket, then opened her laptop at the kitchen table. She compared Richard's public schedule with the dates of the North Valley meetings. On 3 occasions, he had been in the same cities as the investment group's managing director. It still proved nothing. At 12:17 a.m., an email appeared in Annie's personal inbox. The sender was Vivian Whitmore. The message contained one sentence. "You have no idea who you just helped." There was no attachment. Annie forwarded it to Margaret and Daniel, then shut down the computer. The next morning, 2 federal investigators were waiting inside Ellis & Cross. Margaret met Annie near the elevators before she reached her desk. "Do not answer anything until I'm beside you," she said. "What happened?" Margaret's expression gave nothing away. "A bank account was opened in your name 6 weeks ago. Yesterday, $100,000 was transferred into it from a Bright Path affiliate." Annie stared at her. "That's impossible." "There is also an email," Margaret continued, "in which you appear to demand payment from Vivian in exchange for keeping quiet." "I never sent anything like that." "I believe you." Across the office, one of the investigators closed a file and stood. Margaret lowered her voice. "Now we have to prove it." The investigators introduced themselves as Special Agent Laura Bennett from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit and Investigator Mark Ruiz from the California Department of Justice. Margaret sat beside Annie in the conference room and placed a legal pad between them. Agent Bennett opened a folder. "Miss Brooks, we're not placing you under arrest. We're asking for your cooperation." Annie kept both hands on the table. "I didn't open that account. We'll get to that. First, do you recognize this email address?" Bennett turned a printed page toward her. The address looked almost identical to Annie's personal account, except one letter had been replaced with a number. "No. The message was sent to Vivian Whitmore's private address 2 weeks ago. It demanded $100,000 in exchange for withholding documents. I never contacted Vivian outside the review." Ruiz slid another page across the table. "The account was opened online using your social security number, date of birth, driver's license information, and home address. My apartment was broken into. We're aware. My laptop was stolen. We're aware of that too." Annie looked at Margaret. "Then they know someone had access to my information." Margaret answered before the investigators could. "They know it is one possibility." Bennett nodded. "The problem is timing. The account was opened before the break-in." Annie felt the room tighten around her. "Then someone had my information earlier. Who had access to your employment and background records?" "The law firm, my university, the foundation after I joined the review." "Anyone else?" "Probably payroll vendors, insurance companies, financial aid." Ruiz asked, "Did you tell anyone outside the legal team what you found?" "My grandfather knew the scholarship names were missing. He didn't see confidential documents." "Did Mr. Whitmore ever offer you money after you joined the investigation?" "He offered to pay for school when someone followed me." "Did you accept?" "No." "Did you ask for a position in his company?" "No." Bennett studied her. "You understand how this looks?" Annie's jaw tightened. "I understand how someone wanted it to look." Margaret placed one hand on the table. "My client has answered the question." Ruiz closed the folder. "We'll need access to her devices, bank records, email accounts, and employment files. You can submit the requests through me," Margaret said. The interview lasted 2 hours. Annie answered every question, but each answer seemed to produce another doubt. When it ended, Bennett handed Margaret a receipt for Annie's phone and work laptop. "We'll return them after imaging," she said. Annie stood. "Am I allowed to continue working?" That decision. Paul Mercer was waiting outside the conference room. He did not invite Annie into his office. "The firm is placing you on administrative leave," he said. "Effective immediately." "For how long?" "Until the investigation clarifies your role." Margaret stepped beside Annie. "Her role is the person who found the fraud." Paul lowered his voice. "Her role now includes a 6-figure payment and an extortion email. Both fabricated. You cannot establish that yet." Annie looked through the glass wall at the desk where she had worked for the past year. Her notebook, coffee mug, and stack of casebooks remained exactly where she had left them. Can I collect my things? Human resources will send them. The elevator ride down was silent. Outside, reporters had gathered near the entrance. Someone must have tipped them off before the interview ended. Annie? A woman shouted. Did Charles Whitmore pay you to blame his family? Were you working with Vivian? Did you use confidential scholarship records to demand money? Margaret guided Annie toward a waiting car. Microphones pressed closer. One reporter called, Is this how you repaid the man who helped your grandfather? Annie stopped. Margaret caught her arm. Do not answer. For 1 second, Annie wanted to turn around and tell them everything. The hospital, the $5,000, the missing students, the altered records. But anything she said now would be cut into pieces and rearranged. She entered the car without speaking. By the time they reached Mill Valley, the story was already on television. The headline read, Legal Intern at Center of Whitmore Extortion Probe. Samuel stood in front of the screen with the remote in his hand. They're calling you a thief, he said. I know. Charles and Daniel arrived 20 minutes later. Charles walked into the kitchen without removing his coat. We'll issue a statement, he said. We'll explain that the account may have been opened with stolen information. Daniel shook his head. Not until the investigators confirmed that possibility. A premature statement could look like interference. Charles turned to Annie. Tell me exactly what happened. I answered their questions. Did they show you the email? Yes. Could anyone have accessed your personal account? It didn't come from my account. It came from an imitation address. What about the bank account? I didn't open it. Charles paced once across the room. Did Vivian ever contact you privately? She emailed last night. Daniel looked up. What did she say? That I had no idea who I had just helped. Why didn't you tell me? I forwarded it to you and Margaret. Daniel checked his phone. It went to quarantine. Charles stopped moving. Was there anything else? Annie looked at him. What are you asking? I'm asking whether there is anything you haven't told us. The room fell silent. Samuel turned off the television. Annie's face changed. You think I did this? I didn't say that. You asked the question. I need the truth. I've given you the truth. Charles rubbed one hand over his face. The evidence is serious. So were the records against you. That is different. Why? Because I know what I authorized. And I know what I didn't. Charles looked toward Daniel, then back at her. If there is any detail, any conversation, any request for money. Annie stood. 3 years ago, you believed my grandfather's life mattered without asking for proof. Today, when I need you to believe my character, you trust a forged bank account before you trust me. This is not personal. A bitter laugh escaped her. For people who are assumed innocent, everything can be called impersonal. That is not fair. No, it isn't. She picked up her coat. Samuel said, Annie. She looked at Charles one last time. Your brother knew exactly what the public would believe about me. A poor black girl helped by a billionaire, then accused of wanting more. He didn't need to prove I was guilty. He only needed to make guilt feel familiar. Charles said nothing. Annie left the kitchen. The next morning, Whitmore Industries announced that Charles had been suspended pending the outcome of the financial inquiry. Richard Whitmore was appointed acting chairman. By noon, he froze every foundation scholarship, canceled the independent review, and announced plans to sell 2 major divisions of the company. Thousands of employees received an email warning of possible layoffs. Annie received a separate notice from her university informing her that her scholarship was under review because of the criminal investigation. She sat at Samuel's kitchen table and read it twice. In less than 48 hours, she had lost her internship, her reputation, and the future she had spent 3 years building. Across the bay, Charles returned alone to his Hillsborough home. The long dining table had been cleared. 14 chairs stood in silence beneath the chandelier. He sat in the same chair Samuel had chosen beside him and looked at the empty place where Annie had been. For the first time, Charles understood that the person who had shown him the greatest loyalty was also the person he had failed when trust became expensive. Annie remained at the kitchen table long after the university notice had gone dark on her screen. Samuel moved quietly behind her, giving her the space he knew she would never ask for. He poured coffee into 2 mugs, then replaced hers with tea when he remembered she had not eaten since morning. They can take the scholarship, Annie said. They can take the internship. They can put my face on every news channel in California. None of it matters because people already decided who I am. Samuel sat across from her. Who did they decide you are? A poor black girl who got close to a rich man and wanted more. Is that who you are? You know it isn't. Then why are you repeating it like their words belong to you? Annie pushed the laptop away. Because their words have consequences. My professors are asking questions. The firm locked me out. Reporters are following us. Maybe the law only works for people who can afford to survive while it takes its time. Samuel removed his old wristwatch and placed it between them. Its scratched face showed 5 minutes behind the kitchen clock. You remember why I keep this slow? He asked. Because you say life already moves too fast. That is part of it. What is the other part? Samuel tapped the glass. It reminds me that being late is not the same as never arriving. Annie looked at the second hand moving across the worn face. Justice is not always fair at the beginning, he said. Sometimes fairness only arrives because someone refuses to stop asking questions. I ask questions. Look what happened. You expected the truth to protect you simply because it was true. Shouldn't it? It should. But people who profit from lies rarely step aside because a good person asks politely. Annie lowered her eyes. Maybe I'm not meant for this work. Samuel leaned back. You mean the work that frightened a powerful man enough to steal your identity, break into your home, and threaten an old bus driver? We don't know Richard did all of that. Then find out who did. I'm suspended. You still have a mind. I don't have access to the records. You still know what questions remain. I may lose everything. Samuel's expression softened. You are not 18 anymore, Annie. Mr. Whitmore gave you a chance, but you built what came after. Nobody can erase 3 years of work unless you help them do it. A knock sounded at the door. Margaret entered carrying a banker's box, 2 paper cups, and the expression she wore when she had already made a decision. I brought coffee, she said. Samuel raised his mug. I have coffee. I brought good coffee. He accepted one of the cups. Annie stood. Am I allowed to speak to you? Or does the firm think I might extort you too? The firm placed you on leave. It did not remove my ability to recognize a client being framed. Margaret opened the box and placed several documents on the table. The bank account was created using a copy of your driver's license submitted through an online verification service, she said. The image came from your employment background file. Ellis & Cross had that file. So did the outside screening company. So did Whitmore Industries after Daniel added you to the secure review system. Can we tell who accessed it? Not yet, but we know who completed the bank's in-person verification. Margaret placed a printed photograph in front of Annie. The image showed a man standing at a bank counter in a baseball cap and glasses. His face was partially turned from the camera. Annie studied it. I don't know him. Daniel does. His name is Eric Sloan. He is Richard Whitmore's executive assistant. Samuel stopped drinking his coffee. Is that enough to arrest him? Annie asked. No. The account was opened through a shell identification service. Sloan can claim he was conducting business for someone else, or that the image has been misinterpreted. We need the original footage and transaction records. But it connects Richard's office to the account. It creates a connection. Do not make it stronger than it is. Margaret produced another document. The $100,000 came from a Bright Path affiliate. The transfer was authorized by a financial officer who resigned yesterday. Do we know where he is? No. Annie walked to the window. A security vehicle remained parked across the street. What about the email? The address was created through a privacy service. The sender used a public wireless network near your apartment. So they followed me, stole my records, then built the evidence around where I lived. That is our working theory. The firm may have suspended you, but I am representing you personally. Annie turned. I can't afford you. I did not mention a bill. I don't want charity. Margaret gave her a flat look. This is professional responsibility, not charity. You discovered the scheme while working under my supervision. I will not watch someone turn that work into evidence against you. Samuel nodded toward her. I like this woman. Margaret took out a yellow legal pad. Now tell me every person who knew you had identified Richard's connection to North Valley. Annie listed Charles, Daniel, Margaret, Leonard, Eleanor, and possibly Vivian. What about the student records? Margaret asked. Richard knew we had them. And the deleted letters? We had not found those yet. Margaret stopped writing. What deleted letters? Annie explained that the original scholarship recipients must have received approval before their names disappeared. Some would have contacted the foundation after their funding was postponed. If those complaints reached Charles, he would have known something was wrong, she said. But he said he never saw them. Then where did they go? The foundation's correspondence system. Margaret considered it. Which office controlled incoming complaints? Richard chaired the Family Oversight Committee. His office received escalated correspondence. Samuel pointed his coffee cup toward Annie. There is your next question. Margaret nodded. We cannot access the system while you are suspended, but we can locate the students. Annie opened the public list from her saved records. She searched the names one by one until one caught her attention. Jordan Lee, she said. He worked at the same airport hotel where I cleaned rooms. He mentioned applying for an engineering scholarship. Can you contact him legally? Samuel asked. The name is public. I can ask whether he is willing to speak. Jordan answered on the fourth ring. At first, he did not remember Annie. Then she mentioned the hotel laundry room and the vending machine that stole everyone's money. The law student, he said. You used to study during meal breaks. I'm still trying. She explained why she was calling. Jordan was silent for several seconds. I received an award letter, he said. Then they told me the funding was postponed. Did you complain? I sent 4 emails. Then I mailed a certified letter. To whom? The foundation first. After nobody answered, I sent one directly to Richard Whitmore, because his name was on the oversight page. Did you receive a response? A staff member called and said the program had been restructured. Do you remember who? No, but I kept the letter and the delivery receipt. Margaret mouthed. Ask about Bright Path. Annie did. Jordan hesitated. I know that name. From where? The hotel. I worked a private dinner in one of the conference rooms. Richard Whitmore was there with 2 people from Bright Path. This was before they canceled my scholarship. Would you be willing to speak with an investigator? If it helps the other students, yes. After the call ended, Annie remained still, absorbing the first piece of evidence that had not come from a corporate server. A knock sounded again. This time Charles stood outside. He had come alone. Samuel opened the door but did not invite him in immediately. You doubted my granddaughter, he said. Yes. You understand an apology does not repair that by itself? Yes. Samuel stepped aside. Charles entered the kitchen and faced Annie. You stood beside me when my own family turned away, he said. I turned away when you needed me to stand still long enough to see you. Annie said nothing. I was afraid, Charles continued, not of losing the company, of discovering that I had trusted the wrong person again. I let that fear make you pay for what my family did. I don't need you to feel guilty. I know. I need you to tell the truth even when it costs you. I will. Her phone rang before either could say more. It was Eleanor. Miss Brooks, she said, her voice low. I found the old visitor ledger. We already have the ledger. Not this one, the previous book. And there is something else. What? A hard drive from the original hallway camera system. The security company told us it had been discarded, but I found it in the storage room. Annie looked at Margaret. Eleanor continued. It contains recordings from the night Mr. Richard removed the laptop. For the first time in days, Annie felt the direction of the case shift. The truth had not arrived yet, but the clock was still moving. Eleanor was waiting in the service office when Annie, Margaret, Daniel, and Charles arrived at the Hillsborough estate. The room sat behind the kitchen, narrow and windowless, with shelves of household records arranged by year. On the desk lay a worn visitor ledger and a black external hard drive covered in dust. I found them behind old maintenance invoices, Eleanor said. The storage box was marked for disposal, but no one had taken it. Daniel put on gloves before touching the drive. Has anyone connected this to a computer? No. Good. Charles looked at Eleanor. Why was the camera system replaced? Mr. Richard recommended a new contractor after several failures. The old equipment was removed, but this drive remained. Daniel placed it inside an evidence bag. We'll have the forensic team create an image before opening anything. Nobody views the original. Annie turned to the older ledger. What period does this cover? The year before the book I gave you. Eleanor opened it to a page, marked with a blue ribbon. Richard's name appeared beside 3 late-night visits by Marcus Vale, managing director of North Valley Capital. 2 of the visits took place months before Bright Path Consulting was registered. Margaret photographed the pages. This helps establish the relationship existed before the contracts. Charles read the entries in silence. Richard told the board he met Vale for the first time during last year's financing negotiations. Then the board minutes are false, Annie said. Or incomplete, Daniel corrected. We still prove each step. By afternoon, the forensic team had copied the hard drive and confirmed that several video files remained intact. The recordings had no sound, but the date and time data matched the estate's security logs. Everyone gathered in the library while the technician opened the first file. The screen showed the hallway outside Charles's study. At 10:42 p.m., Richard entered with Vivian and Marcus Vale. A fourth person followed, carrying a silver briefcase. Eleanor leaned toward the monitor. That is the man I didn't recognize. The technician advanced the video. At 11:18, Richard emerged from the study holding Charles's backup laptop. The man with the briefcase carried a small black device and several folders. Vivian remained inside for another 14 minutes. The next clip showed Richard returning the laptop 2 days later. Daniel wrote down each timestamp. We can compare these times with the signature logs and vendor payments. Annie opened the existing timeline. The first BrightPath transfer was approved the next morning at 3:14. Charles stared at his brother on the screen. He used my house, my computer, and my signature. Margaret looked at him. Do not say that publicly yet. The video proves access. The forensic analysis must show what was done on the device. The technician connected the copied data from the signature system. Device identifiers linked the backup laptop to 17 approvals. 9 occurred after Richard's recorded visits. 3 matched communications between BrightPath and North Valley. Daniel's voice remained measured, but the conclusion had changed. We now have a direct path from Richard's access to the fraudulent approvals. Is that enough for the authorities? Charles asked. It is enough to expand subpoenas and support a request to freeze assets, Margaret said. It is not the end. Annie studied the timeline. Richard plans to dissolve the foundation tomorrow morning. Charles turned. How do you know? His public notice said the board would vote on restructuring at 9. Daniel checked his phone. The proposed resolution transfers the foundation's remaining assets to a newly created educational trust. Who controls the trust? Margaret asked. Daniel scrolled through the attachment. 3 trustees. Richard appoints 2. Annie looked at the balance sheet. If they approve it, he moves what remains beyond the current board's control. Charles picked up his phone. I'll call the directors. Margaret stopped him. Several of those directors supported your suspension. A phone call will not stop the transfer. Then what will? A temporary restraining order. Daniel nodded. We need to show immediate risk, probable wrongdoing, and harm that cannot be repaired once the assets move. Annie placed the scholarship list beside the financial records. The harm is already documented. Students lost tuition, housing, and enrollment. Because the awards disappeared. Margaret looked at her. We need declarations. Jordan Lee agreed to speak. I can contact the others. You cannot coach them. I'll ask what happened and let them describe it. For the next 4 hours, Annie called students from the original list while Margaret listened. Some numbers no longer worked. Others went to voicemail. 6 students answered. Nia Franklin had left college after losing campus housing. I thought I had done something wrong, she said over the phone. They never explained why the scholarship vanished. Isaiah Turner had used credit cards to cover tuition after returning from military service. Maria Alvarez had delayed nursing school to help her mother through chemotherapy. Each agreed to provide a sworn statement. Annie typed their words without improving them. Margaret corrected only dates and identifying information. Keep their language, she said. A declaration should sound like the person who lived it. Near midnight, Daniel returned from a call with federal investigators. They're willing to seek warrants for Richard's office and North Valley's records, but not before tomorrow's meeting. Then we file now, Margaret said. The legal team worked at the library table while Charles paced between the windows and the fireplace. Annie assembled the scholarship declarations. Daniel prepared the corporate records. Margaret drafted the emergency petition for San Mateo County Superior Court. Charles stopped beside Annie. Will the students have to appear? Not tomorrow. Their declarations can support the request. And after that, they may be interviewed. He looked at Nia Franklin's statement. She left school because of this. Yes. I approved the annual reports that claimed she had been paid. You did not know the list was false. I did not ask enough questions. Annie looked up. Being deceived does not make you guilty of the theft, but it does not erase your responsibility to supervise what carried your name. I know. It was the first time he accepted the distinction without defending himself. At 2:30 a.m., Margaret submitted the petition electronically. A judge agreed to review it before the morning vote. No one went home. Eleanor brought scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee at dawn. Samuel arrived with a security driver shortly afterward, refusing to remain in Mill Valley, while Annie worked through the night. You look terrible, he told her. Good morning to you too. You need food. I had toast. One piece? Tfu. He nodded. Then I withdraw half the criticism. At 7:18, Margaret's phone rang. Everyone stopped speaking. She listened, thanked the caller, and ended the call. The judge granted the temporary order. The foundation assets are frozen until a hearing. Charles released a breath. Daniel gathered the evidence files. Richard does not know yet. Let him walk into the meeting believing he still controls the vote, Annie said. Charles looked at her. You want him surprised. I want him unable to move the money before he understands what we have. Margaret closed her briefcase. We also need the board, the investigators, and the public to understand this is not a family argument. Annie placed the declarations on top of the file. Then the students come first. By 8:30, the team entered Whitmore Industries through a private garage. Reporters crowded the main entrance. Employees watched from office windows, waiting to learn whether the company would be divided and sold. Inside the boardroom, Richard stood near the glass wall, speaking quietly with two directors. The resolution dissolving Whitmore Foundation lay at every seat. He smiled when Charles entered. You no longer have voting authority, Richard said. Charles took the chair opposite him. I'm aware. Richard noticed Annie. Then Margaret and Daniel carrying sealed evidence boxes. His smile weakened. What is she doing here? Margaret placed the court order on the table. Preventing you from moving another dollar. Richard read the first page. The color drained from his face, though his voice remained controlled. This is temporary. So is power, Samuel said from the doorway. Everyone turned. Samuel stood with one hand on his cane, and his old watch visible beneath his cuff. Annie crossed the room to him. You weren't supposed to come upstairs. I rode too far to sit in the lobby. Richard looked from Samuel to Annie. This meeting concerns corporate governance, not personal theater. Annie placed the students' declarations beside the proposed resolution. No, she said. It concerns the people whose futures you converted into numbers. Outside the boardroom, federal agents stepped off the elevator. For the first time since the scandal began, Richard was no longer controlling which questions entered the room. Richard remained standing while the federal agents entered the boardroom. Special Agent Bennett carried a sealed folder, and Investigator Ruiz followed with two members of the Financial Crimes Unit. They did not approach Richard immediately. Daniel rose. Before anyone speaks, this meeting is being preserved under legal hold. No document is to be removed, destroyed, or altered. Richard placed the court order on the table. This is an internal board meeting. Federal observers do not have the right to interrupt corporate business without a warrant. Agent Bennett set the sealed folder beside Margaret. We have warrants for your executive office, your electronic devices, and records connected to North Valley Capital, Bright Path Consulting, and the Whitmore Foundation. Several directors shifted in their seats. Richard looked at Charles. You brought federal agents into your own company? Charles remained seated. Your choices brought them here. Richard laughed once. You have been suspended. You no longer speak for Whitmore Industries. No, Charles said, but the evidence still speaks for itself. Margaret distributed copies of the temporary restraining order. The court has frozen all remaining foundation assets. This board cannot dissolve the foundation, transfer its funds, or appoint trustees to the proposed replacement entity. A director named Howard Bell removed his glasses. On what basis did the court grant this? Evidence of fraudulent transfers, falsified scholarship records, and immediate risk that additional assets would be moved beyond recovery, Margaret said. Richard looked down the table. Temporary orders are granted without hearing both sides. This proves nothing. You're right, Annie said. The order is not the proof. She placed the original scholarship roster on the screen. Beside it appeared the altered list. The proof begins with the names. Richard looked at her. You are still under investigation for extortion. You have no standing to address this board. Margaret answered before Annie could. Miss Brooks is not appearing as counsel. She is presenting factual work completed under licensed supervision. The investigators are aware of her status. Agent Bennett added, evidence recovered yesterday supports the conclusion that the account in Miss Brooks's name was created using stolen identification. Richard's expression did not change, but his hand moved away from the proposed resolution. Annie began with the first vendor. She explained how BrightPath had billed for workshops that had no venues, instructors, attendance records, or materials. She showed how the contracts had been divided to remain below the threshold requiring additional approval. Then she moved to the scholarship records. These 312 students were approved, she said. Their files contained transcripts, enrollment verification, award letters, and signed acceptance forms. 6 weeks later, their names were removed. The payment totals remained unchanged. A photograph of Nia Franklin appeared on the screen beside her declaration. Nia lost campus housing when her award disappeared. Maria Alvarez delayed nursing school while caring for her mother. Isaiah Turner used credit cards to remain enrolled after military service. These were not incomplete applications. They were people whose names were replaced, so the money could be reported as distributed. Richard leaned back. Even if the program was mishandled, that responsibility belonged to Vivian. Vivian was seated near the far wall with her attorney. She had been brought in under subpoena before the meeting began. Until that moment, she had said nothing. Daniel displayed the visitor ledger and security footage. The board watched Richard enter Charles's study with Vivian, Marcus Vale, and the BrightPath director. They watched him leave carrying the backup laptop later linked to 17 unauthorized approvals. Richard looked at Daniel. I had permission to use that office. Did you have permission to use Mr. Whitmore's electronic signature? Daniel asked. No. Did you remove the laptop? I carried it to a meeting room. At 11:18 at night? We were reviewing documents. Why was the hallway camera disabled? For privacy. Why did you tell the board you first met Marcus Vale during last year's financing negotiations when this ledger records 3 earlier meetings? Richard glanced toward the directors. Informal introductions are not negotiations. Annie changed the screen to the loan agreements. North Valley Capital obtained lending rights that allowed it to force asset sales if Whitmore's share price remained below a set level. At the same time, money disappeared from the foundation, public confidence collapsed, and North Valley prepared offers for the company's most valuable divisions. Howard Bell looked at Richard. You presented those loans as emergency flexibility. They were approved by the finance committee, based on information you provided, Charles said. Richard turned toward him. And you signed the reports. I did. The room quieted. Charles continued. I failed to supervise the foundation. I trusted people because they were family. That was my responsibility. But I did not authorize false recipients, fabricated vendors, or a plan to sell this company after its value was deliberately damaged. Richard stood straighter. Then prove I did. Vivian finally spoke. He already has. Richard looked at her. She placed a small digital recorder on the table. Her attorney said, My client is cooperating with federal investigators. You recorded me? Richard asked. Vivian's mouth tightened. I learned from watching you record everyone else. Agent Bennett connected the device to the boardroom system. The audio began with the sound of glasses and distant music. Richard's voice followed. Charles will protect the foundation until it buries him. Once the board removes him, North Valley takes the medical division. We move the remaining assets into the trust, and the rest can be sold. Vivian's recorded voice asked, What about the intern? Richard replied, She is perfect. Young, poor, grateful, and black. The public will believe she wanted more money, long before they believe a Whitmore stole it. No one moved. The recording continued. Put the account in her name. Let the press do the rest. Agent Bennett stopped the audio. Annie had known what Richard believed about her. Hearing him say it still struck with force. She felt Samuel's hand settle over hers. Richard looked around the table. That recording was obtained illegally. Your attorney can raise that issue in court, Bennett said. Stand up and place your hands where I can see them. Richard did not move. You think this company survives without me? He asked Charles. The banks will tear it apart. The stockholders will sell. Thousands will lose their jobs. And she will still be an intern nobody remembers. Charles looked toward Annie. She remembered 300 names you erased, he said. That is more leadership than you have shown in your entire life. Ruiz stepped behind Richard and secured the handcuffs. As the agents led him toward the glass doors, flashes from cameras outside the boardroom reflected across the walls. The room where Richard had controlled votes, contracts, and reputations had become the place where his own words condemned him. Vivian lowered her eyes as agents collected her recorder. She had exposed Richard, but no one mistook cooperation for innocence. Howard Bell looked at Charles. What happens now? Charles turned to the students' declarations. We restore every legitimate scholarship. We cooperate with investigators. We stop the sale of the divisions, and we tell the public what happened. One public statement will not repair the company, another director said. No, Charles replied, but accepting responsibility is where the repair begins. Outside the boardroom, reporters were already gathering around the elevators. Daniel advised Charles to let legal counsel speak first. Margaret agreed. Annie looked through the glass at the microphones and cameras. For weeks, other people had told her story for her. They had turned a hospital payment into a bribe, gratitude into greed, and her silence into guilt. She picked up the original scholarship list. I'm going out there. Margaret studied her. You do not discuss evidence outside the approved statement. I won't. What will you say? Annie looked at Nia's name, then Isaiah's, Maria's, and the hundreds beneath them. The truth about why this matters. Charles moved beside her. They will try to make this about me. Then don't let them. The elevator doors opened. Annie stepped forward carrying the names Richard had believed no one powerful would remember. Annie stepped out of the elevator carrying the original scholarship list against her chest. The lobby below was crowded with reporters, camera operators, employees, and several students whose awards had been frozen. Charles walked beside her, but when the microphones rose, he stopped half a step behind. A reporter called out, "Miss Brooks, did Charles Whitmore pay you to protect him?" Another shouted, "Were you working with Vivian Whitmore?" Margaret moved closer, ready to end the questions. But Annie raised one hand. "My name is Annie Brooks," she said. 3 years ago, when I was 18, my grandfather was in cardiac care at Street Matthew Medical Center. I was working mornings at a bakery and nights cleaning rooms at an airport hotel. I had postponed college because I was trying to keep him alive. The lobby quieted. We were still $5,000 short. The hospital had already granted 2 extensions, and my grandfather was going to be transferred to another facility. Mr. Whitmore heard me asking for more time. He paid the balance without asking for publicity, repayment, or anything from my family. A reporter near the front lowered his microphone slightly. Annie continued. I told him I would never forget his kindness. He told me not to spend my life remembering a debt. He told me to return to school and become the person I had planned to be. Charles looked down. I did return, Annie said, but I did not come back to repay a personal favor. I came back because money promised to more than 300 students had been stolen. Those students had earned their awards. They had completed the applications, met the requirements, and made plans based on promises this foundation had given them. She opened the folder and held up the original list. This is not a list of expenses. These are people. One student left nursing school while caring for her mother. One veteran used credit cards to remain enrolled. One young woman lost campus housing after her scholarship disappeared. Their names were erased because someone believed poor students would not have the money, influence, or public attention needed to fight back. A reporter asked, "Are you saying Charles Whitmore had no responsibility?" "No," Annie replied. "I am saying he did not steal the money. I am also saying he failed to supervise a foundation that carried his name. Both facts matter." Charles looked at her, then stepped toward the microphones. "She is right." His voice carried through the lobby without effort. "I trusted people because they were family. I approved reports I did not examine closely enough. I failed to read complaints from students who had already been promised help. That failure made the theft possible." One of the directors standing behind him shifted uncomfortably. Charles continued, "I have been cleared of directing the fraud, but being deceived does not erase my responsibility. Whitmore Industries will cooperate fully with federal and state investigators. Every legitimate scholarship will be restored. I will sell personal assets, if necessary, to replace any money that cannot be recovered." A reporter asked, "Will you return as chief executive?" not without independent oversight. The company will appoint an outside compliance committee, add community representatives to the foundation board, and create direct reporting channels for employees and scholarship recipients. No member of my family will control those systems. Is the company still at risk of bankruptcy? Daniel answered from the side. The court order has stopped the transfer of foundation assets. The fraudulent lending arrangements are under review. Several banks have agreed to suspend enforcement while the investigation continues. Charles added, we still face difficult months. There will be no quick return to business as usual, because business as usual helped create this. The investigations continued through the winter. Richard Whitmore was charged with fraud, identity theft, market manipulation, obstruction, and conspiracy. Vivian pleaded guilty to charges related to the false contracts and agreed to testify in exchange for consideration at sentencing. Properties purchased with foundation money were seized, and millions of dollars were returned. The board canceled the planned sale of Whitmore Industries' medical division. Independent auditors rebuilt the company's financial records, and the banks restructured the loans after North Valley Capital's role became public. Some projects were delayed, and several executives resigned, but the company avoided bankruptcy. Thousands of employees kept their jobs. Annie was cleared when investigators proved that Richard's assistant had used her stolen records to open the account. The university restored her scholarship. Ellis and Cross ended her suspension, but Annie did not return immediately. She spent the remainder of the semester helping Margaret contact students whose names had been removed. Charles offered her a financial reward. She refused. He offered to pay the rest of her education. She refused that too. What do you want? He finally asked. They were sitting in the Whitmore Foundation conference room, where the altered scholarship lists had once been approved. Annie placed a proposal in front of him. Restore every award. Create an emergency fund for students whose families face medical crises. Add legal support for recipients dealing with housing, debt, or discrimination, and let students have representatives on the board. Charles read the proposal. Nothing for you? This is for me. He looked at her. This is what the $5,000 meant, she said. Not rescue. A chance. The new board approved the reforms. Charles later offered Annie a part-time position in the legal department while she completed her degree. You know I'm not a lawyer, she said. I know, and I won't agree with you just because you helped my family. That is why I am asking. She accepted under Daniel's supervision, with written duties and the same review process required of every other candidate. 4 years later, Annie graduated from law school and passed the California bar. She spent 2 years at a nonprofit legal aid organization before returning to Whitmore Industries through an independent hiring process. At 27, she became Associate General Counsel for Corporate Ethics and Foundation Oversight. She was not Charles's most trusted advisor because she defended him. She was trusted because she told him when he was wrong. At the Foundation's annual scholarship ceremony, Samuel sat in the front row wearing his old watch. He still kept it 5 minutes slow. Charles sat beside him instead of at the head table. A girl of 18 approached Annie after the ceremony. My father is in the hospital, she said. I may have to leave school. Annie asked her name, listened to the details, and directed her to the Foundation's Emergency Assistance Program. Charles joined her after the girl walked away. He noticed the worn business card Annie had taken from her wallet. You still carry that? You told me to build a future with the chance you gave me. I keep it to remember where that future began. Charles looked toward the students gathering with their families. You returned far more than $5,000. Annie shook her head. Kindness is not a debt, she said. We only have to pass it to the next person. Samuel checked his slow watch and called from the front row. If you two are finished solving the world, lunch is getting cold. Annie laughed and slipped the card back into her wallet. Years earlier, Charles had believed his kindness would disappear in a hospital hallway. Instead, Annie carried it through work, study, humiliation, and a fight against people who believed money could bury the truth. She had not returned to save a billionaire. She had returned to protect what his kindness had once given her, a fair chance. The story reminds us that true kindness is never wasted. A small act of compassion can give someone the strength to rebuild a future, while gratitude becomes most meaningful when it is passed forward. It also shows that loyalty does not mean blind obedience. Real loyalty requires honesty, courage, and the willingness to confront wrongdoing. Justice may come slowly, especially when money and power protect the guilty, but one person who refuses to stay silent can help restore dignity, opportunity, and hope to many others. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.